I should be audible, even with my mask. Welcome. We're here to honor and to celebrate Dr. Brigitte Hamon-Porter's promotion to full professor. Once again, I have this fancy introduction to tell you how great she is. And she said, short introduction, we're talking about my topic, which is way more interesting than me. So I will give you a short introduction of Dr. Hamon-Porter, who has earned her promotion to full professor by being a scholar, a teacher, and a servant to her colleagues. So I'll just give you the rundown. I'll give you the numbers. In addition to the 5 peer-reviewed essays that she published after she was promoted to associate professor, she has taught 25 distinct classes since she's been here. If any of you want to complain about how many new preps you've done, she's done more. She has served on over 20 committees, the campus community. But I would like to say what her external reviewers have said about her scholarship. This is a quote: "I believe that Dr. Hamon-Porter's published work is outstanding, incisive, well-written. In addition to being very readable, it is clear that she is a careful and well-informed scholar who knows her 2 areas of expertise extremely well and fluently. Her work breaks new ground in its assessment and reassessment of cultural artifacts, and it is unambiguously authoritative in both its register and its content." This is extremely impressive for Dr. Hamon-Porter, not only because she's written her dissertation in one of her areas, but the second area, the area that we're going to hear about, is one that she came up with after she got tenure, after she got promoted the first time, and in response to student need, which once again combines her scholarly interest with the needs of you, our students. So please welcome Dr. Hamon-Porter as she gives us Algerian stories. Forgiveness and love.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandra, for this nice introduction. I don't think I deserve it, and I've learned a few things. It seems that I have forgotten over the 30 years what I did. So anyway, yeah, short-term memory. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming and for spending 1 hour of your time, maybe more, with me, listening to a topic that you may not know much about, but I've been interested in for over 3-4 years, specifically Algeria. And so, to begin with, you may wonder why I decided to focus my research on Algeria. When I was, as Dean Visser said, when I was a graduate student, I wrote my dissertation on 17th century novelists from France and Spain. So I have traveled far from that place in time and also geographically. Though Algeria was always somewhat familiar for me growing up, because I did read books that we had to read, was required reading, by Albert Camus. I'm just going to show you up here. That's Algeria. A few facts about Algeria before I start with the topic then. It's the largest country in Africa, right? And the population is located mostly on the coast. A lot of the country is desertic and arid land. So now Albert Camus, that's who really introduced me to Algeria. And he was a writer, a philosopher. He wrote novels, philosophical essays, short stories, and among which The Outsider, L'Étranger. I don't know if some of you have read the book, The Plague, La Peste, and he received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957, and is considered a French writer, although much of his writing is filled with images of Algeria. It is the setting of L'Étranger, The Plague, and a number of short stories, and one of his famous essays, Nuptials at Tipasa. And it's Nos here that we have on the screen. So I'm just going to read an excerpt from Nuptials at Tipasa. Here, that's Tipasa. As in much of his writing, Camus celebrates in this essay the beauty of the Algerian landscape. In springtime, gods dwell in Tipasa, speaking through the sun and wormwood perfume, the sea in its silver armor, and great bubbles of light in piles of rocks. Camus left Algeria when he was 17, and he settled in France afterwards, but he visited Algeria regularly. Though Camus' writing is pervaded by his longing for Algeria, Algerians themselves are ambivalent about the legacy of Camus. The reason for this ambivalence is rooted in his position during the War of Independence. So this brings me to the second point of introduction, which is through the Algerian War of Independence. Camus lived through the Algerian struggle to gain independence from France, and it was roughly from 1954 to 1962. Algeria had been a French colony for over 120 years when war broke out between rebel groups seeking independence and the French army and administration. And here you see an old map of Algeria when Algeria was a French colony. So it's divided in counties, départements, because it was really integrated in the administration of France. And here you see how the conquest was done, a violent conquest. Yes, and then we're going to go over some more of the brutality of war as the years goes by. Algerians thought Camus would use his fame, because he became a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957. They thought he was going to use his fame to defend their fight for independence. He did not. Instead, he condemned the violence used by both sides, and there was plenty of violence. And I would have to say that the French army, for example, conducted most of the violence. They bombarded villages. They used summary execution of men who were suspected of being rebels. They burned villages suspected of harboring rebels. They imprisoned thousands of men and women suspected of being rebels. And they used torture and ultimately used the guillotine to kill those who were suspected of carrying out attacks. I checked recently how many people had lost their lives through the guillotine, because it's always associated with the French Revolution, but it was used until 1977 in France. And it's more than 100 people, Algerians, lost their lives this way. So the rebels led a guerrilla type of war, which is what you can do when you're just outnumbered and outgunned. And that reminds us of what's happening right now, right? And targeted those who represented the French government, police officers, random soldiers, and as the fighting escalated, they planted bombs in places where the Europeans gathered. So, for example, cafes, airports, buses. And here, I just need to show you a little bit of this. This is the movie, the famous movie, the movie that you need to watch in order to understand what was going on during this period. And it was made in 1967. It was banned in France for 5 years after its release. It's really almost like a documentary. Then, let's see here. So by the time Algeria gained its independence in July 1962, anywhere from 500,000 to more than 1 million Algerians, and civilians and fighters, had lost their lives, along with nearly 40,000 French soldiers and pieds noirs. And pieds noirs is literally black feet, and it refers to the European population. And I say European population because a lot of immigrants came from southern southern Europe. So you had people coming from Spain, from Italy, from Greece, and also from France. In fact, the mother of Camus was from Spain. So to this day, there is a lingering animosity between the Algerian and French governments over a war that happened 60 years ago. Just recently, and I just read that in the news, French President Macron was faulted for not addressing more fully the responsibility of the French during the colonial period and the War of Independence. And here I need to comment a little bit on these pictures. So you have the picture at the bottom here, you see a French soldier. It was during the war, right? And see villagers here. At the top, you have Algerians in the rebel army. And here, in 1962, that's the group of men who brokered the peace, who signed the peace agreement with the French. And it was signed in Evian, and Evian is a small town near the border of Switzerland. So, yeah, so this group, one more thing I need to mention is the group is called FLN, which is short for Front de Libération Nationale. So that's the main group that the rebels, that's the ones who really led the fight and who were responsible to take over from the French once Algeria gained its independence. So these were my two entry points, through literature, with Camus' powerful evocation of the land where he grew up, and through history, with the brutal War of Independence. This provides a useful introduction to my topic because the Algerian stories that I'm going to present are closely woven into historical events. So let's fast forward 30 years after independence, so 1962, 30 years after that. We are at the beginning of the 1990s. And to set the stage, I need to go over a few more historical events. And so stay with me for a little bit more story here. The rebel group that brokered the peace in 1962, so the FLN, is still in power today. But in 1989, after pressure from the population to change the status quo of a single-party regime to become more democratic, so parliamentary elections were held. So the government, in essence, said, oh, okay, we're going to make it a little bit more palatable to you, and allow more parties to participate in the political life. And so okay, and I just have to click here. Okay, that's the rule of the FLN, right? The party that stayed in power until the period I'm going to talk about. And so it's a one-party system. It's the army and political elite that suppressed for 30 years and until today, suppressed calls for true democracy. And so it's blamed for mismanagement, corruption, and at the same time that all of that was happening, there was a population growth. And so you can see a little bit the problem that's going to happen, because you have young people who have not gone through the war and who are really starting to question the hold of the FLN on power. This is a picture of the protests that broke out in 2019 against the government. And this is President Bouteflika, who was running for a 5th term. Everybody's like, yes. So it did not happen, and you see why. You see the poster here. no, you can't. That's the population, the young population said, no, you cannot run for a fifth term. We don't want that. And so he did not. Instead, the political elite just replaced him with someone else. Is it better? Not sure. But it's not this older president who was almost, he was not even alive almost. You could see him, he was barely showed him on TV. And when he was shown on TV, it seemed like he was not there. So of course, yeah, it poses problem because it's a big country and you want someone who is really mentally fit to run the country. So, okay, so the government said, okay, we'll have parliamentary elections. And the first round was held in December 1991. And the results showed that in the second round, the FIS, and again it's short for Front Islamique de Salut, or Islamist Salvation Front, an Islamist political group was set to win a majority of the seats in parliament. So panic for the government. And so the army abruptly cancelled the second round, and this is what you could call a coup, right? And they started, by doing that, they started a civil war between armed Islamist groups and the government / army, because the two function as one. And this war lasted 10 years, right? At the beginning of the 1990s, the targets by the armed Islamist groups were anyone representing the government, the army, the police officers. Then they targeted the journalists, foreigners, writers, and in the end, anyone suspected of siding with the government or any known personalities who denounced the Islamists. So these were dangerous years to live in Algeria. In the years 1997, 1998, the violence reached a peak when the population of entire villages was murdered. At the end of what is called this Black Decade, about 200,000 people had died. The vast majority of them were civilians. And I'm going to show you this here. The destructions that they brought into the cities, and some of them here are posing, not for selfies because probably it wasn't used at the time, but just for propaganda purposes. So the violence unleashed in the country took everyone by surprise. Algerian intellectuals, journalists, writers, movie directors devoted their works of the 1990s and beyond to give an account first of the violence and to show the physical and psychological effects of these atrocities on the population. Second, they tried to understand why this violence, the reasons behind it. And three, they presented scenarios for the country to perhaps one day move forward once the conflict was over. So they wondered what to do with this memory, whether to forgive or not your own fellow citizens, because they were family members, neighbors who took up arms and joined these groups, these terrorist groups. The first one of the Algerian stories I want to present is a movie titled Rachida by Yamina Bashir Chouik. And Bashir Chouik wrote the script during the Civil War. But she was only able to film it after the end of the war for safety reasons. Although she filmed it, it was done in 2000, it was released in 2002, and in 2002, the country was still not completely at peace. There were still terrorist groups who were waging war and had decided not to lay down their weapons. So, and she said in interviews that it was still in a very iffy place where she filmed the movie. The actors sometimes didn't feel safe. So when you watch the movie, as I did several times, many times I think, you can feel the rawness of the experience, almost like a reenactment of the traumatic experiences that actors had just gone through themselves. The story is that of a young woman, Rachida, who teaches in a school in Algiers. One of her former students is now a young man. His name is Sofiane. He follows her in the street, and that's the beginning of the movie. And he threatens to harm her if she doesn't agree to plant a bomb in the school where she works. She refuses and is shot. So now I'm going to show you an excerpt of the movie, right? Just this, the beginning of the movie. And it's subtitled in English, so you'll be able to follow.
هذا حتى انا حاكمين راح يطوا تبعتونا ها
سفيان
شدي المسيد حطيها في المسيد
ليلى 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 سفيان ليلى
عبسي سيدي من هنا
ليلى ليلى
حطي البومبا في المسيد ولا ما تحطيش
شي لبسي شي في الدراري ليلى
هذا حتى انا حاكمين راح يطوا تبعتونا ها
So, no. So, I want to reassure you, she survives, right? Now, since she is a marked woman, she and her mother flee to the country, and they settle in a small village where the nightmare starts again. The village is attacked by a band of terrorists who kill the villagers randomly, and in one of the scenes, she has what you could call panic attack, and she cries out, where was all this hate buried, this cruelty, this barbarity, these hearts deserted by all humanity? This lamentation reflects the state of stupor and disbelief the population experienced when faced with the brutality of the terrorists. There are a few themes that I will tease out from the movie. First, there is the inability to escape the violence and the feeling of entrapment inside a country that seems cut off from the rest of the world, as if the world had abandoned them. Two, there is also the sentiment that it's difficult to trust anyone in a community that could have gone for, Rashida says, I'm in exile in my own country, end of quote. As I mentioned earlier, anyone in the community could have gone to the other side and become a murderer. The movie shows, my third point, that in addition to the state of insecurity, Algerian society, with its patriarchal order, places constraints on women that made them twice as vulnerable. In the movie, a young woman who is in love with a village youth, and that's when she is in the village with her mother, is forced by the family to marry another man that she doesn't love. The women are pressured to wear their headscarves. Rashida, when she teaches in the school, is always asked by her colleagues, why aren't you wearing the headscarves? You know, this is what Islam wants us to do. Women are as well the prey of terrorists who kidnap some of them for use in their hideouts to serve as slaves. And so that could be slaves to cook or also sex slaves. When one of these women had been kidnapped, escapes and returns home to her family, the father rejects her because she has now dishonored the family. Yet one of the emphasis of the movie is on the decency and resilience of the common people. You see women protecting and helping each other. You see them keeping the community afloat. You also see an old man, for example, who despite threats by the terrorists, keep resisting and just speaks his mind. And he will be killed in the end. So as you watch the movie, that's my fourth point here, you see in the background the living conditions of the population. And that points to the failure of the political elite to provide the basic necessities for the population. For example, water is rationed in the city, and there is a scene where the mother and Rashida are rushing to the bathroom to fill the bathtub with water because it's going to be turned on for just 1 hour, and then that's it for the day. There is no more water. You see a lot of young men loitering, pointing to the lack of economic opportunities for the youth. And so I checked the number. I wanted to find a number for the population at this time, like in the 1990s. But I could only find one for 2018, and that indicates that 50% of the population is under the age of 30. And it was probably higher at the time, 1990s. My fifth point here from the movie that I see that is a main theme is that the terrorists are everyday young men. You've seen in this excerpt. They are dressed as just anyone, or just with street clothes. They could be the neighbor next door. So it suggests that many young men joined the terrorist groups and committed the violence on people they knew because maybe there was no other good option. That's it, just because out of boredom, maybe. You know? In an interview that she gave just after she released the movie, Bashir Shweik, the director of the movie, states that the fact that, quote, our youth became involved in the most horrible barbarity was a failure of Algerian society, end of quote. So the movie ends with a close-up shot of Rashida, the main character, who after the night when the village, there's an attack by the terrorists. So after the night is attacked, she survives again. She is a survivor, right? She survives 2 attacks. And she goes back to her dilapidated classroom and writes on the blackboard the lesson for today in Arabic script. And then she looks straight into the camera. And that's the end of the movie. Thus, a response to the violence and intolerance is defiance and also more education. So the ending conveys a hopeful message. It signals that if Rashida's generation has been sacrificed, maybe there is hope for the newer generation, and there is no time to waste to better teach the younger generation. And the school appears to be the place where that can be done, where you can teach the young people to live together and respect one another. So, and that would be to counter the message of hopelessness and hatred of the terrorists. Now, the second Algerian story that I want to present is a story by Maïssa Bey, and it's called Since My Heart is Dead, or Because My Heart is Dead, here. Puisque mon cœur est mort. It's a novel published in 2010. In her novel, Maïssa Bey looks at the possible causes for the violence, and she also examines the state of emergency declared in 1992 and the Concorde Civile, or the Amnesty Law of 1999, a lot of nines. She finally touches on the issue of forgiveness, and that's also part of my topic. Here, I want to also talk about Maïssa Bey a little bit. She's a French teacher. She taught for a long time in a French high school, when she taught French. In Algiers, I believe, no, not in Algiers, one in another city. And she started to write during the Black Decade to process the anguish, anxiety that she was going through, living through that period of time. So I'm going to read what she said in an interview. She said, "The extremists wanted to bring the country to a halt. Our resistance was at the level of daily life. Going to work, opening your store in the morning, going to the lycée, high school, to teach each day, hoping it would not be your last. The terrorists would have forbidden the teaching of French, also music, sports, and drawing. As an unveiled woman, I was well aware that my flaws were numerous. But I never worked as well with my students as in those years. Together we made each lesson a little island of resistance. I encouraged dialogue. I taught not only French, but the values I believe in." So now I want to take us back to a bit and go over the measures that were put in place by the government to contain the violence, because if you don't know that, it's hard to explain what goes on in the literature and the movies, the next movie I'm going to present. So a state of emergency was declared in February 1992. So if you remember, follow chronologically. So the war really started, the armed Islamist groups started to wage war in 1991 when the elections were cancelled. And so in February 1992, the state of emergency restricted the rights of freedom and expression, so that was intended to better control those who were suspected of supporting the Islamists. But it also had the effect of controlling those who criticized the government, right? It's a double-edged sword. So the state of emergency severely limited the ability of journalists to investigate terrorist acts. And when you look for pictures, as I have for this presentation of the period, there are very few. There is almost no recollection of what happened during this period, because journalists were not allowed to enter sites where the killings had taken place. So the official line was it was necessary to prevent the population from panicking. Right? And here, another of the measures that were put in place by the government in 1999, President Bouteflika granted his pardon to 2,300 imprisoned Islamist militants and passed his National Reconciliation Law, granting amnesty to members and sympathizers of the AIS, stands for Armée Islamique du Salut, or Armed Islamist Army. No. So people, in a sense, mocked this law and said it was not an amnesty law, but an amnesia law, encouraging people to forget what had happened. The third measure that was put in place was in 2005, the country adopts the Charter for Peace and National Reconciliation. And I have a lot of things here on the PowerPoint and slide. And it reminds me that I always say to my students, don't put too much on the slide. Here I am doing that. So anyway, I wanted you to follow along because there are quite a few things that I thought are interesting and worth mentioning here. So the amnesty was for state security forces. There was restraints on debate and criticism of the security forces' conduct during the conflict. That raises a flag, right? Islamic groups who were surrounding were pardoned if they were not implicated in massacres, rapes, or bombing. That's another flag. Because how do you know? Are they going to come forward and say, I killed this number of people, now pardon me? They're not going to say that because they want to go back into civilian life without being bothered. So you had all these people who came back into civilian life, and the population was really worried about them because what did you do? We don't know exactly. Although they said, hey, I'm pardoned now, you cannot touch me. No? In the end, 10,000 Islamist fighters took advantage of that and then were reintegrated into civilian life. The reactions were swift. Families of victims were against it because justice was not served by giving a blanket pardon. Organizations for human rights were against it because it promoted amnesia and ignored the plights of victims. And you see why, right? So there was no justice. When Bay's text is written, only the first law had been passed, so in 1999. So what is the story of Since My Heart Is Dead? It's a first-person account by the mother of a young man killed in an ambush at night by terrorists in the streets of his city. It's an epistolary novel, so it's a novel made of letters. And so the mother addresses the dead son. In these letters, she reminisces about times of happiness when they were together, and she weaves into these scenes the imagined scene when he was shot. And she keeps playing that in her head. And she keeps seeing him dying alone on the street. The mother writes that her writing project was born out of the need to fight against the indifference of the world. Part of the mother's reason for writing is the refusal to let her son disappear into oblivion. After all, he's just one of the thousands who have already been murdered. The flashbacks in the letter are presented in a non-chronological order, and this structure closely follows the symptoms of trauma. The symptoms of trauma are characterized by fragmented, repetitive, and delayed memories. So as the mother tries to understand the reason for the madness that has seized the country, she mentions several reasons that she almost immediately rejects. One of them would be to consider the young terrorists as victims. She writes, if we stick to the most common definition, the young terrorists would be, in a way, only tom-thumbs rejected by their parents because of poverty. They would have found refuge near the ogres being the hardened terrorists who indoctrinated the youth, who, to lure them, would have dangled before their eyes, their innocent eyes, the most coveted of rewards, direct access to paradise and in first class. And to that, she says, it's too naive an explanation. That's not enough. I do not accept that. So you can see that the fragmentation of the text indicates not only the trauma, but also the impossibility of naming what is at the origin of the terrorist madness. It's like trying to comprehend the multiple reasons of an evil that, because of its enormity, is impossible to define. So the mother, in the end, is able to track down the murderer of her son and decides to kill him. Yet the final act of revenge gives pause because the mother is closing in on the young man. the murderer of her son, and he turns around and sees her with her weapon drawn, and he lets out the last word of the novel, Yema. And Yema means in Algerian, Arabic, mom or mother, as he is shot. So this cry for help takes us back to the beginning of the novel, when the mother recounts the murder of her son, who, according to her, could only cry out her name, Yema, when he was shot. So what to make of this ending? Should we conclude that the mother's name, or the mother's crime, excuse me, which is a repetition of the one committed on her son, will once again engender the tears and the impossibility to forget, replayed by another mother? Is it to say that not being able to forgive leads to an endless cycle of retaliation with no end to the violence? This lack of resolution is symptomatic of the debate at the time, right after the end of the conflict. So what to do with the former terrorists? Do you seek vengeance? Or do you accept them back in your community and forgive them? What do you do with that many people? These questions bring us to the third and last Algerian story that I have for you. I'm looking at the clock. I think I'm fine, right? It's a movie by Merzak Alwash called Le Repenti, or in translation could be The Repentant. I don't know if it's a good translation, or The Reformed Terrorists. It's filmed in 2011, and it looks at the consequences of the 1999 civil concord or harmony law, which allowed the terrorists repentant to be reintegrated into civil society. In the first scene of the movie, the young man, le repenti, the repentant, flees from his former band of terrorists in the mountain to his village, a very poor village where his family welcomes him back with open arms. But there are some in the village, however, who have had family members killed by terrorists. And very soon it becomes clear that if he stays there, he's going to be in trouble. So he goes to the nearby city and gives himself up to the police to take advantage of the law on the reintegration of terrorists in the community. The police officer at the police stations, and it's an interesting scene, he looks at him and he grunts, he's like, oh, okay. He's somewhat disgusted that he has to do that. He does that against his will, but he's forced to do it because this is his job, and the state has declared that they should give them a second chance. And so the police officer finds him a job waiting tables in the coffee shop in the city, where he has to deal with the hostility of the customers. They keep their distance. They know this young man is a little bit iffy, his situation. They know he's done something that is probably not right. And so the repenti is back for a short visit in his village. And when he's back, the father tells him that another repenti, another terrorist who had repented, was just killed by villagers. So then the young man, the repenti himself, knows that he could be next. So to save his life, he decides to contact the parents of a young girl who was kidnapped by the terrorists when he was a terrorist in that group. And she was killed. So he offers to show the parents the burial place in the country in exchange for money. He calls them, he tells them, I know where your daughter is buried. If you want to see the burial place, meet me there, and then I'll take you to the burial place. But in exchange, you'll have to give me a lot of money so that I can, the reasoning is I can leave the country and be safe. So the parents, still grieving, seize the chance to maybe find closure. And I'm going to show you the trailer. The subtitles are in French, but I trust that with my synopsis you're going to be able to follow on the story.
أنا هبط بلا ما نخبر الخاوة. صعيبة الحالة في الجبل، صعيبة ياسر.
درت الشيء اللي كان لازم يندار يا ابني.
والله خبيث يا مجرم انت عارف انت تساوي
روك لازم نروح الجدرمية سجل روحي.
يدوك يسقسوك يحطوك إرهابي دائم.
عندي حاجة تهمك بزاف باغي نسمع.
شكون انت؟
انت تمنو تيروريست كلب تمنو.
اركب
ترحم جدا.
اركب. كيفاش تعرف الادريس تاعي؟ كيفاش تعرف اسمي اسم بنتي؟
ماشي أنا اللي قتلت بنتك.
هاهم ليك 10 ملايين وإحنا رايحين نعطوك الدراهم اللي طلبتهم. بنتي وين راهي؟ بنتي اللي اديتوها لي.
ما جعل ربي يغفر لك برك.
To talk about this later, but I don't want to play that because it's going to play the movie, the trailer again. So, okay, here. So in the end, the repenti, as you see, takes them to the place where the girl is buried, and then we see in the distance boots. In fact, the scene that you see at the beginning of the trailer is what you see at the end of the movie. And so you hear the clicking of arms as the soundtrack, and then we hear gunfires, and then Allah Akbar, which means God is great, and it's the praise that terrorists usually shout when they are about to kill or to be killed. And so we know that the terrorists found the couple, and that the former terrorist and the former terrorist and killed them. So what to make of this movie? The main character, the former terrorist, seems to go through life without direction. He says very little throughout the movie, but the few interactions he has with members of the family or outsiders show that he feels no remorse. He's not a hardened terrorist, though, and you saw his face. He's really seems to be very frail physically. He doesn't seem to be dogmatic, but rather clueless. He walks stooped, and I think that's interesting. Each time we see him on the streets, he's like that, as if he wants to hide. He's not comfortable in the city anymore. And when talking to his family, he says, "Oh, that life was hard in the underground." That's all he says about his life there. And so later, he denies having killed a young girl. In short, he refuses to take responsibility for his action and active support of terrorism. Needless to say, he never asks for forgiveness. So on the other hand, denied proper justice, the parents of the young girl are led astray, and when they think they will find solace from grief, they become the latest victim of more violence. So you can see in this novel and these two movies several threads that keep showing up in all of them that I already highlighted. And so first, I like to go through points like the first one. So the first is writers and movie directors, by giving an account of the violence, act as witnesses and chroniclers of the Black Decade. And since the beginning of the 90s, the army government had prevented any investigation and debate on the violence committed. Then these works of fiction offer a place where the memory is kept alive and questions are asked to all those responsible to account. Second, they also reflect on the causes for the violence, so poverty, hopelessness, indoctrination, ignorance. All of that is present in all of these works. They also, third point, emphasize the need for justice, without which there is no forgiveness and no moving forward in society. So now I would like to finish this talk by mentioning a few studies on trauma and forgiveness. And I'm going to use the works by Paul Ricoeur as well, and Vladimir Yankelevich, both philosophers who have written extensively on memory, evil, and forgiveness. So the first slide is Paul Ricoeur, who in his work, Memory, History, Forgetting, says, or writes, the duty of remembrance requires that through remembrance we do justice to the victims by becoming their spokesperson. End of quote. Another, you see, I'm going to use these three studies on trauma and writing history. And so another study says, like Shoshana Thelman is the first one, and Dory Laub in Testimony, Crisis of Witnesses in Literature, Psychoanalysis and History, add that wanting to testify implies an additional responsibility vis-à-vis the community for which one is testifying. So that is of not betraying. If you're going to be reporting on the facts, you need to be true to what happened. Hence, the narrative strategies that we see in this novel and these movies of emphasizing authenticity, the immediacy of the experience, the neutrality of the victims, and you see they all have no agenda. They're just the collateral casualties, teachers, parents of this drama they've been thrown into. So for Bashik Chouik, Bey, and Alouache, the three writers or movie directors that I used here, to refrain from writing or witnessing would have been an abdication of their responsibility towards their community. And I quote Maïssa Bey, who gave this interview shortly after the publication of her book, here. And she says, "It took me all this time to summon the courage to tear loose from the black room certain painful images that obsess or assault one and leave one wondering about the role of the inhuman. There was the desire to take a stand against silence and amnesia and denial." According to Paul Ricoeur, and I'm almost done, remembrance can be defined as a struggle against forgetting, but a memory that forgets nothing would be monstrous. And here, I had it here, yes. In another study, one of the slides that I showed earlier, Dominique Lacapra, in Writing History, Writing Trauma, writes that the active forgetting of the past cannot take place without a work of memory, which must be exact in its memories. Thus, to allow healing to begin, one must be as precise as possible when retelling the events. Then one can start to actively forget parts of these memories in order to then forgive and keep on living, and not constantly reliving the past, as the mother is doing in her letters. For Ricoeur, it's only when this work of memory has been done and faults have been signed and accepted that forgiveness can be contemplated and a community can begin to heal. So you can then see that there is one essential missing piece of the equation here in all of this work. The admission of guilt and the plea for forgiveness is completely absent. Right? So the admission of guilt and the act of repentance are therefore crucial steps to allow the healing to begin. In his essay on forgiveness in connection with the Holocaust, and here is by Vladimir Yankelevich, warns against offering forgiveness to those who do not deserve it and do not show sufficient contrition. He writes, just an aside, Yankelevich had Russian parents who immigrated to France at the beginning of the 20th century, and they settled in France. And he, Vladimir Yankelevich, lived through the Nazi occupation in France. So that's why a lot of his work is really focused on this notion of evil and how to live with these memories and whether to forgive and how to forgive. So he writes, why should we forgive those who regret so little and so rarely their monstrous crimes? The eagerness to fraternize with the executioners is a grave indecency and an insult to the victims. By excusing the crimes almost immediately, this cowardly indulgence has rendered forgiveness not only unnecessary and premature, but also not possible. In the case of the amnesty granted to terrorists shortly after the events, and this is the argument developed in Since My Heart is Dead and The Repentant, justice was not served because the criminals did not ask to be forgiven. In Bay's text, the mother states that the pain of loved ones cannot close nor be satisfied with this reconciliation that the torturers do not want. And so the mother has no other recourse than to take justice into her hands, and thereby perpetrating the cycle of violence. And the parents in the movie, Le Repenti, are also left vulnerable to extortion and to more violence. So now, without forgiveness, forgetting is impossible. And a memory that cannot forget becomes monstrous, to use Ricoeur's expression, and can morph into acts that engender an endless cycle of destruction. And I'm going to end my talk here and take questions and comments. So thank you. I know there is a lot here. Right? So any comment, maybe not even a question. Luca. Yep.
But my grandparents are from Algeria, and I have been there, and I know that President Brigitte was like the president for a long time, and my parents always told me that, but I never thought that it was like a problem because I never was shown what had happened in the past. I never knew the background, like all that had happened and everything that made like this president kind of not legitimate, because like it's the people don't really choose, they're kind of forced, and I never knew that, I was never told that, so it's like interesting for me to learn this, and I never really looked into it, but it's interesting for me to know this, and now I know why my grandparents left Algeria. I think they were like, they felt like they had to go because they couldn't bear seeing their country being like kind of torn like this.
Like when did they leave?
I think they left after the independence, like around 64, I think. 65 was my dad was like.
Yeah. I don't know, so maybe that's the time to talk to your family about it. Why did they leave, really? Because in 1964 there was a lot of hope still that the new government would bring about, just prosperity, peace. It did not happen because one reason is that, and I think someone did no, Olivia is not here. One of my students did a paper, not in my class, but she told me about it, about Algeria's economy and the major sources of wealth are from gas, natural gas, and oil, petroleum. So it's another one of these petro-states. If you control these resources, you control power. And so it's really more of like a kleptocracy. All these people who have the power band together. And so they replaced one, like Bouteflika, who was obviously too old to govern, but they put another one in his place, and things are. And still, so I was looking at the news recently because I was doing this presentation. I thought, okay, what is happening now in Nigeria? You know, in 2022, and things haven't changed. Although the young population, it was really adamant in 2019. They wanted something different. They were ready for democracy and for change. And just almost like their hopes have been dashed again. But we'll see. But the thing is, they insisted when they did this demonstration in 2019 that it be without violence, because they didn't want it to spiral and for the government to justify using violence against them. So it was very interesting to watch. And I remember teaching a class on that the same time. And so we were watching what was happening in the news. And you see these people in the streets and saying, yeah, it's time for a change in government. And here we are, 2022, and it still hasn't changed. So, yeah. Yeah, the status quo. Yeah. So another comment, yeah. Yeah. Let me see. Yeah. Pardon, Yankelevich. Up. This one.
Yeah. So are you arguing that because there isn't justice, they can't forgive, and thus you end up with a memory that doesn't forget anything? Is it monstrosity in its liability to cause violence? Is that your thesis?
Yeah, I think so.
And that's what makes it monstrous.
Right. And it's monstrous because for several reasons. It's monstrous because it does harm to the person who cannot forgive and continue living normally. And then it forces people to take extreme measures to just erase or get justice themselves, and to erase that part of the memory. I suppose that's, multiple reasons why it can be monstrous. Yeah, it's a good point. Yep. About, I'm sorry, about. Okay, yep. Yeah. Well, so the Black Decades, during that period of time, there were other crises in the world happening. So I think in Yugoslavia, 1994, I think I remember, that was when Milosevic, that was the president of Serbia, started his ethnic cleansing. I don't know if some of you remember or know that you remember that. And so there was a lot of attention on that. And then 1994 was also the genocide in Rwanda. And so the attention of the global community was really diverted. I mean, just focused on these two things, one in Europe, one in Africa. And Africa, they felt like they had let down that country. And so Algeria, and that's why I said, like in the movie, it seems they feel like people had forgotten about them. And people even in interviews say, yeah, it seemed like no one was caring about us. Nobody cared. Except for, it seemed that in France, because there was this community, that Algerian community, people knew that things were happening. But media was really controlled, and so the information was not really flowing freely, and they never knew. I think the problem with Algeria at that time, Algerians didn't trust the government, army. They didn't really, and so they were caught in the middle. Who to trust? And some even accused the army of perpetrating some of these massacres, so that the population would turn against the Islamists. How twisted is that, right? And so there were people who said, well, survivors said, well, it was strange because, like, They supposedly had beards, like supposed to be representing Islamists, but underneath I could see the clothes of maybe like army clothes, and so, but it's like rumors. You don't know because again, people were not allowed to discuss that. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Maybe I could start with the second question, and I think it's one reason I started with the colonial period in France, to show that there was so much violence at the start, right? That the country and its independence rested on a violent act, and that a lot of people, observers, said Pierre Nora is one of the foremost historian of that period of the War of Independence, and he says that this is because, in a sense, this is the only way that they felt they could resolve the problems, through violence. And you could say also that Fanon lived in Algeria, where his burial place is in Algeria, right? And he said that you have to use violence in order to overthrow a force like the French colonial powers, in order to use violence against violence. Otherwise, you're not going to do any. It's not going to do any good, right? It's not. You're not going to be able to overcome. So use the means that the powers that enslave you or keep you down, use that power. And so you're completely right. I forgot to mention Fanon. I think he was. But I was not concentrating on the War of Independence. I was concentrating on that second Black Decade. So yeah. And the first question was truth-telling. Yeah. So I don't know about your question, because I think that these stories here are. At least the first two, think they are almost like an immediate reaction to what happened. The third one is the repenti, which is more of an interpretation, and you could say, okay. But I noticed in the movie he seems to be not taking sides, or because the young man, the repenti, in a sense, is a victim. You can tell. You feel sorry sometimes for him. Right? And so it's not as if he's taking one side against the other, but he's just showing the problems. I don't think he's taking sides, because the young terrorist at the end is killed as well. Right? And so I don't know if it answers your question, but that's how I can do. That's what I can do here, thinking on my feet. Another question, or maybe it's time for us to... Yes, Fred. Good question. Not really anything happened because the Black Decade had been so awful for the country that they didn't want that to happen again. So when all the other countries did something and rebelled against their the regime in place, the autocrats in place, nothing happened in. It was almost like they did it before and they did it after, but they didn't do it when it happened in 2011. And it was next door. It was interesting. It was right next door in Tunisia. That's where it all started, right? So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
On behalf of other people.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder to what extent the same challenge is there in this situation in Algeria when so many victims are gone and yet their families are there. But it seems like this is a politically orchestrated attempt at reconciliation. And even assuming there would be
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Real repentance.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent is a solvable
Mm-hmm.
issue? Is there real mass forgiveness on behalf of people?
Right. It's a little bit, it's complex because now 20 years have passed, right? And so some people say, well, let's not look back because it's not going to do anything now. But there's still mothers and parents who still have lost people, disappeared, not accounted for, and they don't have any answers from anyone. And no one has to give them any answers because of these laws. So I don't know. I think all the problems, things that have never been solved, like real justice, it's going to come back again at some point in society. It will. And so I don't know how it's going to manifest itself, but it seems that I hope, in a sense. And it gives me, because when I was doing that, I thought, this is exactly what's happening in Ukraine now. How can you forgive what's happening with Putin, right? And so there has to be repentance, and it seems like this is not a person who's going to repent ever. So how do you move forward in the world? Yes, Sion? Uh-huh. Good.